So the truth is somewhere out there. Right now, to me, it is clearly evident that our problem is with the demand curve and spending. Our economy has crashed because of that. These folks are really believers in no regulation or very little regulation. In my mind, that's what got us into the problems we're in today. The housing market, the subprime market, the venturesome lending and instruments used by the large investment banks. We gave up supervision of those back in the 90s when Clinton was president and the Republicans ran Congress, and they got out of control. When you leave markets alone, they tend to go to extremes and create bubbles and Minsky moments and that kind of stuff. But if you over-regulate them, you tend to dampen down the growth of the economy and slow things down, and too much of that's bad too. Now, this range of the supply curve is what I want to look at for a little bit, because it's got a positive slope, but it's neither vertical nor horizontal. And remember, up here on this axis, we're measuring the rate of inflation. So for any given equilibrium, we read over to that axis, and that tells us what the rate of inflation is. For grins, let's call it 2%. And in that sense, maybe this graph on the board right now is a realistic representation of sort of what's going on in our economy. We're way below full employment, and we have a very low rate of inflation. Now, see if you, I think it was this class we did it, yeah. If you get a treasury bond that pays 1% and inflation is at 2%, what is your rate of return? Negative 1%, because inflation destroys the value of your money. You remember that? In fact, what you've got today is treasury bonds after inflation are paying almost nothing. They're very close to each other. That means for most businesses, if you can go out and borrow money today at 3% and inflation is at 2%, what's that loan costing you? Only 1%. A 1% real interest rate. That's true for our government as well. When we hear talk about the government so far in debt it shouldn't borrow anymore, in fact, our debt is equal to a little over 100% of our output, our GDP. Oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. But the fact is, if the government is borrowing money today, it's borrowing it at almost no cost. Almost 0%. Now, if they didn't waste the money and they put it to productive use, you could argue that they could get the aggregate demand curve to move out. They tried to do that in 2009 with a stimulus. But the stimulus wasn't large enough. It was very poorly targeted. It didn't have nearly the impact it could. But a lot of people who are raising Cain about the stimulus and that waste of government money overlook the fact that without that stimulus, our 9% unemployment likely would have gone up to 11, 12, 13%. And that's by research by the Congressional Budget Office, who's neither Republican nor Democrat. That's an objective view. So the argument now is, if we were able to stimulate the economy, and here's kind of what I want to ask you, and suppose we got the aggregate demand curve to go out to AD2, so we have more spending. Our equilibrium goes up here. Are we better off, or are we worse off? Let's call this equilibrium A, equilibrium B. Are we better off or worse off at equilibrium B?
Our inflation is higher, so it depends.
Well, my answer to that, are we better off or worse off, is yes. Yes, we're better off and worse off. We're better off because we got more people with jobs. The unemployment rate is getting closer to 5%. Maybe it's at 7%. That's good news. But the bad news is that now inflation has climbed up some more, maybe to 4%. You okay with that? Pretty clear? That's what happens when you have this little curvy part to the supply curve. What if you go out here to AD3? Equilibrium is up here to C now. Was that a good move to go from AD2 to AD3?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. But the gains in employment are not as large, while the increases in inflation are getting higher, larger.
Yeah.
So the closer you get to full employment, the bigger the danger of inflation. And I know in teaching macroeconomics these days, we haven't seen inflation in this country to any significant degree since 1979, 1980. The kids I'm teaching about today have no clue what I'm talking about. You remember the rule of 72? If inflation's kicking along at 11 or let's say 12%, what's that doing to your cost of living? It means your cost of living doubles every 6 years. 12% into 72. They can't even put their mind around that idea. And then you got in 1979, that's what was going on. Yeah, so do I. Now, this is fiscal policy, trying to shift the demand curve. Now, on the syllabus for tonight, or on the course schedule, we're supposed to talk about monetary policy. And so I wanted to have a few minutes to put some of that down, okay? There's two ways to affect the economy. Fiscal policy, who conducts fiscal policy?
Government.
Which part of the government?
Congress.
Congress and the President. How many people in Congress? I need more room to write. Hang on.
High school civics.
High school civics. You're dating yourself, Susan. I don't know if they even know the term civics anymore. Do they have a high school course called civics anymore?
Like history.
I think they have a government.
Government.
Okay. In the U.S. Congress is made up of two houses. Who are they? The Senate and the House of Representatives. How many people in the Senate?
100.
2 per state.
2 per state.
100 members. And they serve a 6-year term. But 1/3 of them is up for re-election every 2 years. So we put 1/3 of them are re-elected or defeated every 2 years. Okay? How many people in the House? You better remember that. That's old stuff. 435. That's based on the population of your state for how many representatives you get. But they divide the 435 among the states, and all of them stand for election every 2 years. And then you have the president who's up for election every 4 years. So now you've got 536 people trying to agree on a policy. Knowing that they have to stand for re-election every 2 years, the majority of them.
Yeah.
Is it any wonder that fiscal policy is a wreck? Particularly over the last, I'm going to say 20 years anyway, maybe 30. The ideological battle between the conservatives and the liberals, or the Democrats and the Republicans, has grown so strong that there is a lack of ability today to agree on anything for fear of appearing too weak. Okay? And it has gotten so bad, and this is again more my opinion, that the arguments on the right have gotten more and more extreme. And now there's no middle ground. What do we call somebody who's in the middle? They're neither strongly conservative nor strongly liberal. What do we call them? Moderates.
Modern.
Say again?
Same.
Sane. And I think, certainly this is some opinion, but they started here. They had differences. But they worked together. They played together. They were friends, and they accepted that they had differences, and they compromised. And then over time, from where you're sitting, on the right, they began to take further extreme points of view. Now, some did on the left, too. And the left was very subject to criticism for giveaway welfare programs, wasted government money, no argument. But over time, the right has grown further and further out here. And now what we construe to be the middle is where Ronald Reagan used to be. A lot of Republicans today out here would not vote for Ronald Reagan if they understood his true policies and the things he did. Now, given all of that, fiscal policy as a tool to manage our economy is just about in gridlock. Nothing's happening. And it's even worse right now, leading up into the election process in November.
I did see something in the news recently about how they're going to probably reject Obamacare.
The Supreme Court for the last 3 days has been listening to arguments for and against elements of Obamacare. In particular, can you require people to buy health insurance? I don't think it's clear what the court's going to say. I think there's one or two on the conservative side that are at least considering that you could in fact have that mandate. If they keep the mandate, Obamacare will pretty well march forward at least until the presidential election. And here's a forecast. I think Obama's going to win because the Republicans have had a hell of a time pulling guns out and shooting each other in the foot.
We all admitted.
Well,
That happens every election now.
it's getting worse. This is the worst I've ever seen. Obama's got some real liabilities. In particular, a lot of people just hate his very name. But I don't know how large that group is in the total electorate. If Obama's reelected and Obamacare passes the Supreme Court, we'll have 4 years of it. And if in 4 years of it, most Americans will not be willing to let it go because it's going to help too many of them. But if that doesn't happen, if they throw out Obamacare, or if Obama is defeated and then they, re-legislate it off the books, your and my health insurance issues are going to get progressively worse. And now we're getting into some real economics and philosophy that I don't think there is a competitive market for health insurance out there. We're just going to take it right in the jaw.
Today the debate was about Medicaid because the Obamacare requires an increase in Medicaid coverage, and is it constitutional to mandate that states, and that's a state cost,
Yeah.
that states take
State
that
share.
on. But there's been precedents set in the past. It's
Mhm.
not a new, and people are treating it as if it's a new mandate, but it's not.
I completely agree with you. And I got a feeling we're on safer ground in that regard if you like Obamacare. The other one, though, to listen to Justice Kennedy, is health care different than other goods? Because the government is not in a position to require that you buy broccoli. That's the one example they're using. But the health care is built around the idea that if everybody's in there paying for it, and the young, healthy people don't need it, they're subsidizing the elderly and the disabled, as they would be subsidized in their future. That's one part of it. The other part is, if you don't buy health insurance because you're young, bulletproof, and invisible, who pays for your care when you do have an accident? And the answer is all the rest of us poor bastards. So why isn't everybody in there? And I think Kennedy sounds maybe open to the idea that this is a different good.
Right. Health
Than
care
anything
coverage
else.
is not broccoli.
Exactly.
It's not a consumable good in the
Right.
same.
Well, we pay for people now who can't.
Well, exactly.
We pay for SSI, we pay for.
Well, we pay for the emergency room visit
Right,
of the person
we
who
pay
doesn't
for
have any health
emergency
insurance.
rooms, we pay for people who can't cover now. I mean, so.
Yeah. So it's a matter of how are we going to pay for it. Are we going to force everybody into the pool and make everybody else pay for it?
Right.
And of course, if you do that, you also get away from pre-existing conditions.
You have to.
You've got to. You've got too many people who are already ill who can't buy health insurance now. What are you going to do with them? Who's going to pay for that, by the way, in the long run? Either you and I are as taxpayers, or they are in their quality of life and or their quality of death. The sermon's over.
Don't get me started.
Yeah, really.
I work in public health, so we're the safety net.
Yeah. I'm sure you could tell us some harsh.
I work in mental health and
Yeah,
government mental health.
you know.
Well, Gainesville is a sort of a liberal bastion in a very conservative.
Forensic
Fourth
mental
state.
health.
I'm sorry?
I said forensic mental health.
Forensic. I don't even want to think about that.